Chapter 27. To say that this revelation immediately turned my life upside down would be inexact. I do not believe that I reacted the way Ghashafwa had presumed I would. I was both abundantly surprised and intrigued, but I was still skeptical. The man did not inspire me with unlimited confidence. How could he know that the manuscript he had leafed through was the authentic work of Khayyam? He did not know Persian, and the wool might have been pulled over his eyes. For what incongruous reason would this book have been in Paris without a single Orientalist reporting the fact? I did no more than utter a polite but sincere, incredible, since it showed both the enthusiasm of the man I was speaking to and my own doubts, for I was not yet ready to believe in it. Ghashafwa went on. I had the chance to meet an extraordinary personality, one of those beings who cross history determined to leave their imprint on their generations to come. The Sultan of Turkey fears and courts him. The Shah of Persia trembles at the mere mention of his name. He is a descendant of Muhammad, but was nonetheless chased out of Constantinople for having said at a public conference in the presence of the greatest religious dignitaries that the profession of the philosopher was just as indispensable to humanity as that of the Prophet. He is called Jamaluddin. Have you heard of him? I could only confess my total ignorance. When Egypt rose up against the English, Ghashafwa continued, it was at this man's call. All the intellectuals of the Nile Valley take inspiration from him. They call him Master and revere his name. However, he is not an Egyptian and has only made a short stay in that country. He was exiled to India, where he managed to arouse a considerable movement of opinion. Under his influence, newspapers were established and associations were formed. The viceroy became alarmed and had Jamaluddin expelled, whence he decided to settle down in Europe, and he continued his incredible activity in London and then in France. He worked regularly on L'Intransigeant, and we used to meet often. He presented his disciples to me, Muslims from India, Jews from Egypt, and Maronites from Syria. I believe that I was his closest French friend, but certainly not the only one. Ernest Renan and Georges Clemenceau knew him well, and in England his friends were people like Lord Salisbury, Randolph Churchill, or Wilfrid Blunt. A little before his death, Victor Hugo met him too. This very morning, I was in the middle of going over some notes about him which I am thinking of inserting in my memoirs. Ghashafwa took some sheets covered in minuscule writing out of a drawer and read, I was introduced to an outlaw, a man famous throughout all of the Islamic world as a reformer and a revolutionary, Sheikh Jamaluddin, a man with the head of a saint. His beautiful black eyes, so gentle and yet fiery, and his deep tawny beard, which reached his chest, gave him a particularly majestic air. He looked like a born leader. He understood French more or less, although he could hardly speak it, but his ever-alert intelligence easily made up for what he lacked of our language. Behind his calm and serene appearance, his activity was frenetic. We soon became good friends, for my spirit is instinctively that of a revolutionary, and I am attracted to all freedom fighters. He quickly put the sheets of paper away and then continued. Jamaluddin had rented a small room on the top floor of a hotel in Rue des Seiz, near the Madeleine. That modest space was enough for him to edit a newspaper which went off by the bundle to India and Arabia. I only managed to wheedle my way into his den, once being curious to see what it could look like. I had invited Jamaluddin to dine chez Douan and promised to go by and pick him up. I went straight up to his room. It was difficult to move around in it because of all the newspapers and books piled up to the ceiling there, some of them even covering the bed. There was a suffocating smell of cigar smoke. In spite of his admiration for him, he had pronounced this last phrase with a hint of distaste, which induced me to extinguish the spot my own cigar, which was an elegant Havana I had just lit. Rochefort thanked me for that with a smile and carried on. After apologizing for the mess in which he was receiving me, and which, he said, was unbefitting for someone of my rank, Jamaluddin showed me that day some books he was fond of, particularly that of Khayyam, which was full of exquisite miniatures. He explained to me that this work was called the Samarkand manuscript, and that it contained the quatrains which had been written in the poet's own hand, together with a chronicle running in the margins. Above all, he told me through what torturous route the manuscript had reached him. Good Lord! My pious English interjection drew a triumphal laugh out of cousin Henri. It was the proof that my cold skepticism had been swept away and that I would henceforth hang on to his every word, and he lost no time in taking advantage of this. Of course, I do not remember everything that Jamaluddin must have said to me, he added cruelly. That evening we spoke mainly of the Sudan. After that I never saw the manuscript again, but I can testify that it existed. But I am truly afraid that by now it has been lost. Everything my friend possessed was burned, destroyed, or scattered around. Even the Khayyam manuscript? By way of reply, Rochefort made a discouraging pout before throwing himself into an impassioned explanation during which he made close reference to his notes. When the Shah came to Europe to go to the World Fair in 1889, he suggested to Jamaluddin that he return to Persia instead of passing the rest of his life in the midst of infidels, giving him to understand that he would install him in high office. The exile set some conditions: that a constitution be promulgated, that election be organized, that equality be recognized by law, as in civilized countries, and that the huge concessions granted to foreign power be abolished. It must be stated that in this area the situation of Persia had for years been the butt of our cartoonists. The Russians, who already had a monopoly on road building, had just taken over military training. He had formed a brigade of Cossacks, the best equipped in the Persian army, which was directly commanded by officers of the Tsar. By way of compensation, the English had obtained, for a sum, the right to exploit all the country's mineral and forest resources, as well as to manage the banking system. As for the Austrians, they had control of the postal services. In demanding that the monarch put an end to royal absolutism and to the foreign concessions, Jamaluddin was convinced that he would receive a rebuff. However, to his great surprise, the Shah accepted all his conditions and promised to open up the country to modernization. Jamaluddin thus went and settled in Persia as part of the sovereign's entourage. The sovereign at the start showed him all due respect and went as far as to introduce him with great ceremony to the women of his harem. However, the reforms were put off. As for constitution, the religious chiefs persuaded the Shah that it would be against the law of God, and courtiers foresaw that elections would allow their absolute authority to be challenged, and that they would end up like Louis XVI. The foreign concessions, far from abolishing those which existed, the monarch, ever short of money, was to contract new ones. For the modest sum of 15,000 pounds sterling, he granted an English company the monopoly of Persian tobacco, not only in its export, but also domestic consumption. In a country where every man, every woman, and a good number of children were addicted to the pleasures of the cigarette or the pipe, this was a most profitable business. Before news of this last renunciation of Persian rights was announced in Tehran, pamphlets were distributed in secret advising the Shah to rescind his decision. A copy was even placed in the monarch's bedroom, and he suspected Jamaluddin of being the author. The reformer, who was by now worried, decided to go into a state of passive rebellion. This is a custom practiced in Persia. When a person fears for his liberty or his life, he withdraws to an old sanctuary near Tehran, locks himself in there, and receives visitors to whom he lists his grievances. No one is allowed to cross through the doorway to lay hold of him. That is what Jamaluddin did, and thereby provoked a surge of people, thousands of men streaming from all corners of Persia to hear him. In a state of vexation, the Shah gave orders for him to be dislodged. It was reported that he hesitated a long time before committing this felony, but his vizier, who was educated in Europe moreover, convinced him that Jamaluddin had no right to claim sanctuary, since he was only a philosopher and a notorious infidel. Armed soldiers broke into the holy place, cleared a passage through the numerous visitors, and seized Jamaluddin, whom they stripped of everything he possessed before dragging him half naked to the border. That day, in the sanctuary, the Samarkand manuscript was lost under the boots of the Shah's soldiers. Without breaking his flow, Rochefort stood up, leaned against the wall, and crossed his arms in his favorite pose. Jamaluddin was alive, but he was ill, and above all, shocked that so many visitors, who had been listening to him enthusiastically, could have stood meekly by while he was publicly humiliated. He drew some curious conclusions from this. The man who had spent his life denouncing the obscurantism of certain clerics, who had been a regular visitor at the Masonic lodges of Egypt, France, and Turkey. He made up his mind to exploit the last weapon he had to make the Shah bend, no matter what the consequences. So he wrote a long letter to the chief of the Persian clerics, asking him to use his authority to prevent the monarch from selling off the property of the Muslims to the infidels. What happened then, you know from the newspapers. I remember that the American press indeed reported that the great pontiff of the Shiites had circulated an astounding proclamation. Any person who consumes tobacco places himself thereby in a state of rebellion against the Mahdi. May God speed his arrival. Overnight, no Persian lit a single cigarette. The pipes, the famous kaylans, were shelved or smashed, and tobacco merchants closed up shop. Amongst the wives of the Shah, the ban was strictly observed. The monarch panicked and wrote a letter to the religious chief accusing him of irresponsibility, since he was not concerned with the grave consequences which being deprived of tobacco could have on the health of the Muslims. However, the boycott lasted and was accompanied by stormy demonstrations in Tehran, Tabriz, and Isfahan. The concession had to be annulled. Meanwhile, Rochefort carried on, Jamaluddin had left for England. I met him there and had long talks with him. He seemed to be distraught and could only say time and again, "We must bring the Shah down." He was a wounded and humiliated man who could think of nothing but avenging himself, all the more so since the monarch, the target of his hatred, had written an angry letter to Lord Salisbury. We expel this man because he was working against the interest of England. And where should he take refuge? In London. Officially, the Shah was informed that Great Britain was a free country and that no law could be invoked to suppress a person's freedom of expression. In private, the Shah was promised that they would seek legal means of restraining Jamaluddin's activity, and he found himself being asked to cut short his stay, which made him decide to leave for Constantinople, but with death in his heart. Is that where he is now? Yes, I am told that he is deeply dejected. The Sultan has allotted him fine quarters where he can receive friends and disciples, but he is forbidden to leave the country and lives under constant and tight surveillance.